All right, so now you've collected your seed, you've cleaned your seed, processed them, and now you want to store the seed until it's time to plant. And there are several reasons why you may be storing your seed. The most common situation is that you collect the seed in fall and you want to you have to wait until spring for whatever reason to plant it. So you're storing it through the winter until spring. But maybe you collected some seed in early spring and you want to store it till you have a chance to plant it later in the summer. There could be many reasons why you're storing the seed. But in my opinion, the main things to consider when storing seed is one is rodent protection, two is mold, preventing mold, and three is mimicking nature to the best of our abilities and understanding what the seed's needs are. And the reason I say this, I mean, it's always a good idea to mimic nature, but I'm in a temperate climate, and most of the species, not all, but most of the species native to a temperate climate, those seeds from trees, the perennial seed, very often require a period of what's called cold or stratification, cold, moist conditions, wintertime, basically, right? The seeds need to go through winter in order to germinate, and we can either put them through actual winter outside or we can kind of mimic the winter through a stratification process indoors in the refrigerator, something like that. So, yeah, keeping the seeds safe from being eaten, typically by rodents, or safe from mold. I guess you could also say the mold is eating the seeds. So safe from being eaten by mold or rodents or whatever. And then also if they need stratification or any other conditions that they would receive in nature, basically mimicking the conditions that they receive in nature, because oftentimes the seeds need those conditions in order to germinate. The other thing that I'll note is that there are several species which germinate in the fall immediately upon collecting them. There is nothing you can do to prevent them from germinating that I'm aware of, and still have viable seeds. So this is typically white oaks. Things in the white oak group will sprout in the fall. So white oaks, chestnut oaks, pretty much all things in the white oak group will sprout in the fall very soon after dropping off of the tree. And so if you're going to store those, you have to take that into account, that the taproot is going to emerge in the fall. You don't want to store those in any sort of condition where those roots could get tangled with each other. You want them to be in a place where they can kind of grow. So we'll talk probably about that at the very end. That's a very few amount of seeds fall into that group, but it's worth talking about because some seeds do. They do fall into that. They do experience those conditions. Let's just talk about that now real quick. With things that sprout in the fall, the way that I store those is I store them where they're going to be planted. So either in a big ear pruning bed or in a big pot, and I just store them one layer thick and they can sprout and grow. All right, so most of this video, I'm going to be talking about storing seed that is wet seeds, things that come out of fruits, nuts, that sort of thing. The seeds that need the cold, moist stratification, right? They don't really want to dry out. They need to kind of experience wintertime. And willow. And but real quick, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the dry seeded crops. This is a lot of my annuals in here, beans and that sort of stuff. But back in here somewhere, I do have some tree seed that's dry storing, and I just want to talk about that. So these are, if I can get the camera to focus, those are honey locust seeds in there, right? And they're just in a jar. I need to actually put a lid on this, but right now I don't have a lid on it. And then I also have some packages here, black locust that I collected myself, some black locust that I bought from the Experimental Farm Network. And, yep, hello, kitty. Seed that's dry and doesn't need stratification, and you got to kind of do a little bit of experimenting on your own and some research to figure out which species that is. Locust certainly can get by without stratification and can certainly be stored dry. Redbud, I believe, can be stored dry. So a lot of the times it's the seeds that come in pods that are kind of dry at maturity. They often can be stored dry, and either in a jar or in a little paper bag is totally fine. And I just keep them, I do have to keep them a little bit protected. I have Willow here, who's great at keeping the mice away, but just in case, I typically keep seeds in a jar. And inside of this cabinet, there's no way for mice to get into this cabinet. It's fully locked up and closed. Well, maybe I shouldn't say there's no way. I mean, mice are pretty smart, but I have never found mice in here. And like I said, most things are in jars that they couldn't get into anyway. So yeah, that's a little bit about how I store my dry seed. That's pretty simple. You just put them in a container and kind of forget about them. There's no risk of mold. There's no risk of sprouting. There's no risk of a whole lot of anything other than mice. And as you can see, mice patrol. Okay, I'm about to close the door. Anyway, the rest of this video is going to be more about the nuances of the wet seed. How do you prevent them from molding and sprouting and rodents and, you know, cold temperatures and all that. And so, but I did want to talk a little bit about some of the dry seeded stuff and what you can get away with that. It's a little bit simpler. All right, so storing your seeds, the way I see it, there's kind of two options, right? One is in the fridge and the other is outside. You can see here I have some pawpaw seeds soaking in a bag, right? And I had another bag that looked kind of like wood chips. So when I'm storing things in the fridge, to me, you know, the way that I typically do that is in these freezer bags like this. I'm sure you could use other containers in the fridge, but I really prefer these bags because they're see-through, so I can kind of see what's going on in there. The pawpaw seeds I'm soaking, and I'll just a real quick note on pawpaw seeds. They really don't like to dry out. If you're into pawpaws, growing pawpaw, you may have heard this before. The seeds don't like to dry out, so sometimes I give them a good soak before they go into storage just to make sure they're nice and fully hydrated. But anyway, bags, right? And then if I'm storing them outside, it's some sort of container. I like buckets because I have a lot of them around, but you could really use any sort of container, metal, wooden, plastic, whatever, outdoors to store your seed. In my experience, seeds stored in the fridge is at a much greater susceptibility to mold, okay? That's just in my experience. I've seen seeds in the fridge mold a lot more frequently than I've actually almost never had seeds mold outside. Now, you may see you may notice these pawpaw seeds. I'm storing them in a bucket, and inside that bucket is also some wood chips and stuff mixed in. Sometimes you'll see some mold growing on the medium, on the wood chips or the compost or the leaves or whatever you're packing the seeds in outside. But you typically will never see mold on the seeds themselves, and things have to get really, really wet. And when you're storing seeds outside, or the way that I do it is I drill a lot of holes in the buckets or the containers, especially at the bottom, so that water can drain through as it rains, and moisture can kind of self-regulate to some extent. So I'm jumping around here a little bit, but let's focus on bags for a second. And if you're going to store your seeds in the fridge in bags, I used to store seeds in either packed sand or wood chips or whatever in the fridge, but I'm moving now towards, if I'm storing seeds in the fridge, I don't really want anything else in the bag. And the reason for that is I have found that it's possible to keep the seeds sufficiently moist in the fridge without any medium, and that because of the fact that seeds mold more in the fridge, I like to be able to visually inspect them often. And so having them in a clear see-through bag with no medium allows me to very quickly open the fridge, look at a bag, and inspect for mold. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about that later in the video, but that's my basic way in the fridge. You can play around with what works for you, but I like in a clear bag with nothing else in there and just the seeds being slightly damp. You know, I don't want to see a lot of standing water in the bag. I just want the seeds to be slightly moist, preferably. Now, if I store seeds outside, this is different because outside temperatures fluctuate. The water's going to fluctuate a lot more because oftentimes I leave these tops, or the tops of the buckets have a screen on them, which allows air and water, rain to come into the bucket. And so these are very different conditions than the fridge. They're more natural conditions. It's not really bad or good that the conditions are different than the fridge, but just there's some different considerations. So I always like to pack my outdoor seeds in some sort of medium to kind of insulate them and hopefully to encourage their microbiome to develop. So if I put rotting leaves and wood chips and sand and things of that nature, I want stuff that drains pretty well, maybe a little bit of compost, nothing too heavy. But I want some organic material and soil potentially surrounding the seeds to insulate them, to facilitate microbial growth and help them kind of promote a healthy microbiome around the seeds, right? Because that's what they would experience in nature. They would be buried on the forest floor throughout the wintertime with rotting leaves and rotting fruit and all sorts of stuff around. So I fill my buckets up with whatever medium feels appropriate. You can kind of experiment with what works for you and what you have on hand. I'm moving more towards liking to use aged wood chips the most, just because I feel like they drain pretty well, but they still have a lot of carbon and organic matter, and they do insulate the seeds a little bit. You can see some of the holes in the bottom of my bucket there. I also find that having really, really good drainage at the bottom of the bucket is important. If you get a huge rain and the top of your bucket is open with just a screen on top, you're going to have a lot of water that you need to move out of the container. You could also try having more of a typical lid that has just a few holes in it and lets less water in, and then, that'd be a slightly different situation than just the hardware cloth screen. So back to the bags real quick. You can see I'm examining some chestnuts and some hazelnuts here in the fridge, and what I'm noticing on these bags right now is that there's a lot of water buildup on the edge of the bag. You can kind of see here. That's a little bit too much water in my opinion, so I will probably pull these seeds out today, dry them off a little bit on a towel. I don't want them to get completely dry, but just dry them off a little bit and then put them back in the fridge. And here you can see an example of, most of the seeds you've seen in this video I cleaned and then put into the storage, but with certain seeds like pawpaws, sometimes I just mix the raw, mashed up fruit into the buckets with wood chips and kind of let that break down over winter. I'll talk more about that in my pawpaw video, but you can just store mashed fruit in these buckets too. So another important thing to note, whether you're storing seeds outside or in the fridge, is to check frequently for germination. I mentioned checking for mold and stuff like that, but you're also checking for seeds that are germinating early. For various reasons, if conditions are too wet or temperatures fluctuate in the wrong ways, seed might decide to wake up long before spring in storage. And so it's important to be frequently, especially in the late winter, to be frequently checking for sprouting seeds, because you can see these hickory nuts, if I let these go much longer, some of those taproots would get so long and tangled up, you would never be able to sort them all out and plant them without damaging and probably killing the seeds. And so frequently checking for sprouting is very important. Like I said, the later into winter you get, the more likely it is that the seeds will sprout. And they'll do this in the fridge, they'll do it outside in buckets. And so I think in an ideal world, if you can check your seeds every 1 to 2 weeks, especially in the later season, that's probably on the safe side. I mean, I've definitely gone longer without checking seeds because life gets busy, but it's really good to check as frequently as you can for the sprouting, for the mold. And just know, if you see sprouting, don't panic. Find a way to plant them. If it's still really cold, you can maybe plant them in a, some sort of pot or raised, like a big Tupperware container or milk crate or something, maybe in a basement or a garage. They'll probably spend a lot of time putting that taproot down before they send up a shoot. So even if it's, late winter and you plant them indoors, you still might have some time before they sprout up. And on a similar note with mold, don't panic if you see mold. If it's just going on the medium, the packing medium, that's fine. If there's mold on the actual seeds, oftentimes it's surface mold, and if you catch it early, you can rub that stuff off and the seed is not too affected. If it goes too long, the mold will certainly kill the seeds. You could probably cut a few seeds open and inspect them to see how significant the damage looks, but don't panic and throw out a whole batch of seed unless you're really, really sure that they're all totally goners and not worth messing with. They can survive a lot. But yeah, mold, sprouting, those are things you really got to be concerned with. In the fridge, you don't have to worry about rodents at all, but definitely if you are doing the bucket method, I've had squirrels chew through a plastic lid on a 5-gallon bucket, which is why I've moved over to using the screens as lids. But just beware, squirrels, voles, animals will try to get in there and eat those seeds. And so anything you can do to discourage that, have cats around, play with different things. They're going to eat some, right? This is their food and they deserve to eat. But, we're putting a lot of work into our seeds, and so we do want to save as many of them as we can. We're also growing out trees that will produce more seed for future rodents. And anyway, so that's a little bit on kind of storing some of the seed, and yeah. All right, so before I end the video, I do want to talk just briefly about how I store the actual buckets of seed. You kind of get the gist of how I'm filling up the buckets with seeds and wood chips and compost and various things. And the buckets have holes to allow drainage. And I do sometimes, like for pawpaw, I'll sometimes just use lids with holes drilled in them. Like I said, I have had squirrels chew through lids. So if it's things like black walnuts that like squirrels really like to eat, instead of a lid made of plastic, I will just kind of fabricate one out of hardware cloth that the squirrels can't get through. You just kind of fold down the sides of a piece of hardware cloth like so. It helps to, it's good to put something heavy on top of that so they can't just lift it off, or you could wrap tie wire or maybe some really strong twine around it to really secure it down. It is important to label your stuff, not forget what's what and where things are, draw a little map, have a little tag on there. And then I do insulate these. I'll either pile up leaf bags around them, or I will put them next to a wood chip pile and kind of bury them in wood chips, something like that, so that they're not super exposed to the elements and really freezing too hard. But it's okay if they get pretty cold, and I'm in the south, so it doesn't stay super cold for long down here. So you got to experiment with it and see what works for you. But that's the basic gist, and I'll keep talking about more specifics about certain species as I do more of this work throughout the fall. And definitely feel free to ask me any questions. I'm not an expert; I'm still learning, and it's good to just share experiences and talk with each other about what we're doing and what's going on.